You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
For our main segment this week, we will be discussing Hegel, Marx, and Dunayevskaya. Co-host Andrew Kleiman has a recent piece out in With Sober Senses, the online publication of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, which serves as an introduction to the first chapter of Dunayevskaya's book, Philosophy and Revolution. This is a chapter in which Dunayevskaya stakes out a unique understanding of Hegel's absolutes and discusses what the dialectic of the absolute means for Marxist-Humanist thought. So we will be discussing the dialectic in the thought of Hegel, Marx, Engels, Lenin, and others in our main segment. And in our current events segment, we will be discussing the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please do visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. In just a moment, we will be discussing Hegel's absolutes, but first, a few words about current events.
It became very clear to me early on that this is, we're going to see an economic crisis of enormous magnitude, and it's not your normal economic crisis. And then I just began thinking about this more and more when, I saw the normal lines of political debate, which is like, how much stimulus and who gets the stimulus and oversight and all of that stuff. It just became very clear to me this is not the real issue here, because your normal economic crisis, downturn, recession, what you have is a drop in demand, a drop in spending, and you get like a drop in businesses' investment spending, so they don't build new factories, new shopping malls, they don't install new equipment, and they don't hire workers, and then you get layoffs, and because of that you get a drop in consumer spending. That's the typical pattern. Okay, so it all has to do with the lack of investment spending. Here it's entirely different. It's not demand driven. It's not initiated by a lack of spending. We have a problem of a lack of not demand but supply, right? I mean, all kinds of stores, retail stores are closing, restaurants are closing, or have closed. People can't go to work, and people are afraid, even where they're not being locked down, people are afraid, and rightly so, to go to the restaurant, not to speak of, movie theaters and sports stadiums and places like that. Okay, so you have to solve the health crisis before you can talk about solving the economic crisis, because the economic crisis is predominantly this health crisis. You're not going to have any sort of economic normalcy unless you have, people who can go to work, right? This is the key thing. And so what becomes of utmost importance is what we don't have is getting supplies, personal protective equipment for healthcare providers, ventilators and all kinds of stuff, for the patients, efficient testing, right? All of that stuff is what's needed to, flatten the curve, as they call it, and to deal with the magnitude of this crisis. That is the key economic problem. And throwing money at the problem in terms of fiscal policy, which is what they've done so far, that's, they can debate amounts and this and that. And all of that's needed to tide people over, so, you don't have people just, losing everything, although that looks like that's going to happen. But, you're just going to be throwing money after throwing money, and the stuff isn't going to be there, and you're just going to get a huge bout of inflation, people spending money for stuff that's not there. The inflation will be bound to eat up everything. And then on top of that, they're borrowing massively already, $2 trillion. And when the U.S. government has to finance the rollover of $2 trillion at markedly higher interest rates because inflation has gone up, oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah.
It could be very, very bad. That's my thinking. And I was like, why aren't these people seeing it? Am I crazy? And then I saw a news story where it said Christina Romer, she's a very good economist. She was head of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. And she said, yeah, look, this is not a demand problem. This is a supply problem. And people are not going to be spending. And you're not going to have the stuff for people to even buy if you don't solve this health crisis. So I began to think, okay, so I'm not crazy. It's the politicians who are just like, pulling, sheets out of their standard playbook and haven't understood what's going on.
Yeah, that's all very interesting. As I was listening to you talk, I was thinking like, I'm not even clear about what it would take to reopen society again, like what steps would need to be in place. And then two, I don't even see any indication that this administration, the Trump administration, which is so criminally negligent on this issue, I don't see any indication that the Trump administration would be able to do any of the necessary steps to make society safe enough for us to reopen our cities again. And then three, like when things do finally open up, it's not clear to me at all like how normal economic recovery happens in that context.
Those are all very good questions, and I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows because this is all unprecedented, and it's all very much because of the whims of an incompetent maniac, elegant narcissist and worse. Yeah. That's the core of the specificity of the U.S. health crisis is that guy is still in office and still in charge.
Yeah.
If you want to look at the one single measure that could be done, one single thing that we could do to alleviate this crisis and stop it from getting worse, it's obvious. Get rid of that guy. Look, nobody even knows. You say in several months. It's like several months might be what you need if you had a national coordinated strategy that was followed in every state.
Right.
And
if states weren't competing with bidding against each other for resources. I mean,
absolutely.
The competition between states over resources is one of the most disturbing aspects of this whole thing. It makes me want to cry when I read about it.
Right. And
we just need some like masks to put on people's faces.
Yeah.
And we're like, states are bidding against each other over this shit. Hospitals are like trying to compete with other hospitals for this.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable.
And meanwhile, Florida, where the governor is, saying, come down to our beaches during spring break and whatever.
Oh my God.
They're getting what they need, right?
Yeah. Just unbelievable that this is the level of the federal government's responding. This is their way of solving. It just is competition.
Right. And the competition is a direct result of policy here. It's not just like it happens. It's like, Trump says, hey, it's not the federal government's job to coordinate this and have a national policy. It's up to the governors. It's up to 50 state governors, to go get, ventilators. Right. So,
and they're competing with FEMA. FEMA is outbidding, is bidding against states for ventilators.
Right. And apparently they're being shipped to China and other countries. It's all crazy. So
yeah, how do we solve? It's like, how do we get out? I just don't see how this country is going to solve this problem. I just feel like it's going to drag on forever. And at some point, there'll be some to kind of get through the curve, and some cities will open up on different by different criteria and at different times, and there's infections are going to roll back into cities and counties.
Yeah, that's what's worrying me is, if it were done right, maybe in a few months you could reopen the economy, normal, semi-normal, partially where, the rate of new infections is slowing, like maybe New York. But if this is all done half-assed and piecemeal, and here and not there, this thing isn't going to go away. And every time you try to do that, it's going to come back again. This could go on for a very long time.
Yeah.
And, I don't think anybody knows. And this is what worries me, is that in the end, the calculus is going to be, well, look, we have to go back to life as normal. Most of us are going to live, especially if we're young, we're going to live. And the old people, they've lived their lives already. And even the medical personnel recognize that. They triage and they say, don't come in, you're too old. And, putting you up to ventilators, no use, and so forth. So this is what worries me, is that in the end, the drive to establish normalcy, which also is related to the drive to get the stock market back up and to get profits back up, there's going to be a renewed push to just let the old people die. We saw that in a big way among lots of Republicans, and it kind of got shut down. They stopped pushing that line. It did not go very well, but I expect it to come back. And in the horrible, perverse way in which capitalism tends to solve its crises, that would be a solution to the crisis. You kill off a lot of old people, relatively smaller number of middle-aged and younger people, and it's absolutely devastating. And worldwide, you got 50 million dead. In the United States, you got 1 million dead, 1.5 million. But then you've got enough herd immunity that you can pick up again.
Right.
That worries me, because
it's how the Nazis envisioned this kind of thing: thin the herd of the weak.
When you look at the economic options that are available, and you really, people talk about a sharp V-shaped downturn. You pull the plug on the economy to flatten the curve, the spread of the virus, and then you can pick up again. But even the people who talk about that say, well, you'd have to get things exactly right, and nobody even knows what's exactly right here.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can talk about that. It's very clear that just throwing money at the problem isn't going to solve anything. And then the alternative is, you just in the end let it rip and let people die. And there aren't that many options here. So it is very, very worrisome.
But just so listeners are clear, we should make the point that societies could safely reopen and be able to control future outbreaks if we had sort of a sanely run country or countries which were able to ensure emergency production of ventilators and protective gear for hospitals and for grocery and delivery employees, and do adequate testing and contact tracing. We could really manage this thing in a humane way without having to just open the doors again and say fuck it.
For sure, and in fact, in principle, that can even be done in capitalism. There are countries, notably South Korea, which had coronavirus came to it and managed to get the problem under control.
Right.
And then there are countries that haven't done that, like the United States, like Italy, like Spain, like France, the UK.
Exactly.
So a lot has to do with just the United States being very poor in any kind of economic and social planning in general, but then Trump killing all the agencies and special task force or whatever that were supposed to deal with this problem, ignoring everything that they warned about. And then when he was warned by, intelligence about the spread in China, he waited 10 weeks. He did nothing for 10 weeks, gave us happy talk, hope, all this, stuff, but he didn't begin to get serious about listening to the experts and doing what they said. He was totally the other way for 10 weeks. And there's, this thing, it spreads, it doubles, every 5 days or so, so 10 weeks is 70 days. So you get a thing go up, it's astronomical how much spread he created by just that delay. I mean, 10 weeks doesn't sound like much in normal terms, but this is a rapid exponential growth, and the spread of the virus. So that's absolutely unconscionable.
Yeah.
So right? I mean, I just wanted somebody to tell me Hillary would have been just as bad.
So, Andrew, today we're talking about your most recent piece in With Sober Senses, which is really interesting. It's doing a lot of different things. For one thing, it's sort of a introduction to the first chapter of Philosophy and Revolution by Raya Dunayevskaya. And but at the same time, it's also sort of a meditation on Hegel and Marxist-Humanism in relationship to Hegel, and the unique way in which Dunayevskaya read and understood Hegel in contrast to other Marxist philosophers. So that's sort of the topic we're going to be talking about today on the podcast. And I have to say that I find Dunayevskaya's writing on Hegel still to be very difficult, and it takes me, time to work through text and remember what different terms refer to and understand the way she's putting together concepts. And especially since so much of what she is doing when she's reading Hegel and writing about Hegel is so different than how we often hear people talk about dialectics or Hegelian method or ideas. So I think your piece is really good in sort of framing some of the key things that are unique about what she's doing.
Well, thank you. I don't have any formal qualifications in philosophy, and it's been a long struggle for me too. I mean, I remember first trying to read the book Philosophy and Revolution. I believe it was 1985, and I understood less than nothing. I was part of like a study group or reading group on it, and it was extremely difficult. All these terms I didn't know, and you know, alternative terms, synonyms being used. I didn't know they were synonyms, and all these references to all these people, and incomplete references, and yeah, it's been a long struggle.
Well, one of the things your piece really goes into is Dunayevskaya's departure from traditional ways of understanding dialectics. When I was reading about this sort of stuff in college, I was sort of presented with the textbook version of dialectics that deals with a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. And Dunayevskaya's work is a real departure from that. So, is that synthesis that results from a thesis and an antithesis, is that a misreading of Hegel?
I'll tell you, I don't have the depth of knowledge to say on my own that it's a misreading of Hegel. I would say that based on the knowledge that I do have, it's certainly plausible to read Hegel differently from that thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. I would say a preponderance of specialists, on Hegel's logic and so forth, agree with Dunayevskaya's view that, the dialectic of negativity is not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There were things that Hegel said also that, very clearly to call that into question. There are some specialists who would adhere to that formula, but Dunayevskaya, and it seems to me a preponderance of Hegel scholars reject that as an understanding of Hegel's dialectic, and it makes sense to me why they reject it.
Right. So why did they reject it?
The real problem with the reading, that involves several problems on top of it, but the basic problem is that the conclusion, the end result of the movement is not a synthesis of these two opposed terms, the thesis and the antithesis. At least not in the way in which synthesis is usually understood, where you have two self-subsistent, self-contained entities and they combine. Okay? It's not that. In particular, because the dialectic of negativity is self-movement. Okay? It's self-movement, development through contradiction. So it's a process in which you're transcending the entire ground of the thesis, that which is, and that which opposes it or negates it. Okay, so there's that opposition. What is, what isn't, or it's this, and then there's that, um, and you don't combine the two. Okay, there's no combination of the two. Rather, there is a transcendence of the ground of that opposition and transcendence of both of the opposites. Okay, and there's a new beginning as a.
I feel like all these all of these categories and discussions are a lot easier for me, at least, when we're dealing with some sort of concrete example. So,
How about if I try to get into the political implications of
okay, yeah,
it not being a synthesis?
right.
It's very, very important, and I think very meaningful when it comes to understanding politics and political thought. This issue of whether the dialectic results in a synthesis or whether it doesn't, because a synthesis is a closure. Okay, you've come to an end. You got the one, you got that which opposes it. Okay, thesis, antithesis. Okay, if that results in a synthesis, that's it. Okay, now you could say, well, you got the synthesis, and that's the new thesis, and it's confronted by a new opposite, a new antithesis, that results in a new synthesis. And that becomes the new starting point, the new thesis, and again and again and again. One can say that. However, regarding the kinds of things that Hegel was talking about in the final chapters of his, main works, Absolute Idea, Absolute Knowing, Absolute Mind, he's dealing with all-encompassing totalities. For instance, Absolute Idea is the unity of theory and practice, right? And absolute mind is the unity of objective and subjective. Okay, and when you think about like theory and practice, they're both forms of human activity, and together they're the entirety of human activity. I mean, everything that people do is either theoretical activity or practical activity, or theoretical in this respect, practical in that respect. Okay, so it's all of human activity. If all of human activity is viewed as a synthesis, that's it. That closure is, at that point, an absolute closure. Okay, nothing new can ever emerge. Okay, so if this is viewed as relevant to politics, what we are talking about is the end of history. Okay, so when you're grappling with these big totalities and you speak of synthesis, of the movement coming to an end, that end is an end. It's an absolute end. Okay, and if that's your understanding of the dialectic, then what one is saying is that the dialectic is the logic of closure, the logic of ending, the logic of nothing new ever emerging. And, that's like the opposite of revolutionary thought and what revolutionaries are all about. So you would just have to reject dialectical thinking as appropriate to revolutionary thought.
Often when we hear people talking about dialectics, the impression is given that it is a general method which can be found in or can be applied to many different phenomena and as sort of a unitary method. But often when Dunayevskaya is talking about, she sounds very specific when she's talking about the dialectic of the absolute idea or the dialectic of absolute mind, as if this is a specific dialectical process that's specific to a specific category within Hegel. So does that mean that, for Hegel, or at least for Dunayevskaya's reading of Hegel, that there are different dialectical processes for different things? Is the idea of sort of a general method a wrong interpretation or understanding of Hegel?
Yes and no. It's dialectical. Okay. Here's how I understand it. On the one hand, everything has its own dialectic, because dialectic is fundamentally about self-movement. And there's no kind of cookie cutter, no sort of preformed plan, or structure in which you can reasonably fit everything in and say everything moves in exactly the same way. I mean, things are different from one another, right? Different aspects of reality have different forms of self-movement. But when we come to understanding just the self-movement, not the specific forms of the self-movement, but just to understand the logic of self-movement, what self-movement is, how you get the emergence of something new that was not there before. That is one and the same principle. So the bare abstract underlying logic is always one and the same, but it manifests itself in myriad ways, and the abstract principle does not take you very far in terms of understanding the particularities of self-movement in a particular case. There you need to understand the subject matter, the different forces, and all of what's involved in the particularity of the situation. I mean, I think that a lot of people come to dialectic thought because they want sort of a master key, some quote method, close quote, that you can apply here and there, and that's definitely not Dunayevskaya's understanding. I don't think it was at all Hegel's understanding. And the other thing I want to say with respect to that, when people talk about a method, and generally when we talk about method, we're referring generally to a tool or an instrument, something that you use. This is not what Hegel's method is. This is not what dialectic method is. Dialectic method is the method of the subject matter. It's not something that you bring to it or apply to it. Okay, things themselves, reality itself is dialectical. Things in reality, aspects of reality, exhibit contradiction, self-movement, so forth and so on. Okay, so the method is their method. And there are actually a variety of methods, and just abstractly we can say, here are the general forms of the method. But it's the subject matter's own method. And all that philosophy and thinking can do is understand this and grasp it and make sense of it, make it intelligible. And that's what I think Hegel was trying to do. But it wasn't like inventing a tool that would open up doors, but he was able to make intelligible the logic of free movement of thinking.
So can we get into this concept of self-movement and how it happens? For one thing, when we're talking about self-movement, what is the self that's being moved? Either the Dunayevskaya is talking about or the Hegel's talking about. And then I guess secondly, how do they understand this self-movement happening?
Okay, what is the self? I mean, to really understand dialectic, you really have to understand self in a very general way, which is the starting point. What one would refer to as the thesis. Okay, that's the self. Now, you want to talk about Dunayevskaya as a revolutionary Marxist-Humanist. I mean, the self is, revolutionary masses of people and revolutionary thinkers are ourselves and, revolutionary organizations. So those are particular aspects of it. But the whole idea of self is really important because, there's a debate in philosophy which is, persists to this day. Perhaps it's bigger than in Hegel's time, as to whether there is anything that is the self or whether this is indeed an illusion. You're Brendan Cooney, and you think of yourself as the same Brendan Cooney that you were at age 14, but just more developed. a lot of people would say that's an illusion. Okay?
Yeah.
But that's the notion of a self, of something that persists through, amid all of the changes. A lot of people would say, look, you were that, and then the matter in your body changed. I mean, your skin flaked off a little bit, and the new cells grew, and there's no persistence. And if you don't have persistence, you don't have development. You just have one damn thing after another, right? I mean, that is a certain view, but when you
Right.
talk about self, right, it really does carry a lot of weight. It carries a lot of meaning of the starting point. It isn't just what it is, but it can develop. It can persist. It can change amid, facing contradictions, confronting problems, but amid and through these changes that it undergoes, and these contradictions and oppositions that it confronts, and the problems, amidst all of this, all of these changes, it persists, it abides, it continues. Okay, so selfhood is a really important concept here. Whether however you want to apply that. Okay, so this is really the logic of freedom that we're talking about. You're not just like some isolated entity buffeted about such that everything that hits you and buffets you about changes you so that you're no longer you.
I see.
Or in philosophical terms, we're talking about subject.
Yeah.
This is the philosophical term for self and subject are really like close.
And so anything
concepts.
anything we're looking at, whether it be a political movement, masses of people, an idea, any subject can exhibit self-movement.
I mean, yeah, but that's what it is to be subject, rather than just object.
Right. I see. Right.
I mean, not everything really exhibits self-movement.
Right. So how does this self-movement happen? If the self or the subject is not just changing and evolving because of the external forces, but it's something that is self-generated and self-moving, what is that process?
Well, it's like the light bulb joke, right? How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb?
I don't know this one.
Oh, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb?
I don't know.
Only one, but the light bulb really has to want to change.
Oh, yes, I do know that one. Right.
Okay, so that's the key, I think. Although when you look at like Hegel's logic, there's a lot of mediation to come to that conclusion. But yeah, the light bulb has to want to change. The subject has to want to change. One of the simplest but profoundest ways, I think, of understanding what the dialectic of negativity is was expressed by Marx interestingly enough, an economic writing, his Grundrisse outline of critique of political economy. And he was writing this is all very ironic in a way. He was writing about pre-capitalist economic formations in a certain passage. And he begins to talk about wealth. He says, what is wealth? And he goes through all this stuff. And he says, once you strip away the capitalist form of wealth, what it is a situation in which the human being strives not to remain what he has become, but is in the absolute movement of becoming. Okay, so he uses a straight out Hegelian concept, not this term, but term and concept there. Okay, strives not to remain something he has become, but is in the absolute movement of becoming. That's a reference to absolute negativity, negation of negation. So you get this idea of becoming, and so what becoming is there's what is, and it doesn't disappear, it doesn't just stop, but it changes, but it persists amid the changes. Okay, so this is again subject. This is again the self that I was referring to, and the key, for Marx, is the striving not to remain something that you've become. Okay, so that's Marx's idea of what a wealthy human being is one that
Right.
is seeking development, one that is seeking to overcome alienation, to be whole, to enrich themselves, through new skills, through new ideas, and so forth. But yeah, the light bulb has to want to change.
So you use the term absolute negativity, and that's something we should define for listeners who are not familiar with the term.
Right. Okay. Absolute negativity is also known as the negation of the negation. Okay. So, how does it differ from, your father's negativity, or what's often called first negativity? Okay. It's not a bare negation. It's not like black, white. Like A, not A. All right? That's a bare negation. And when you have a starting point or thesis, and you just negate it in that manner, you end up with nothing, or you end up with the starting point. For instance, in mathematics, you have A, then you've got minus, so you got positive A, you negate it, you got negative A, you negate the negative A, you got positive A, you're back at the starting point. Okay, so that's not self-movement, you're just, going around in a circle. Okay, but that's one aspect, moment, but not in a moment in time. That's one aspect of negativity. But there's the process of transformation. There's the process of transcendence. Okay, so the movement of the one being met with the other does not have to result in either nothingness or a return to the beginning, okay? But if you can transcend the ground of that opposition, the one, the other, if you can transcend, or technically sublate that ground, you have a new beginning, okay? So it's a question of, when you've got this opposition or contradiction, can you find a way out of it? And if so, how do you find a way out of it? Okay, the answer is always specific to the case, the subject matter, but the general principle is an insurmountable opposition can be overcome only by transcending the ground of that insurmountable opposition. And that's what makes it absolute. Okay, because it stands on its own foundation. As a result, you've moved to a new ground. So it's not relative to the starting point, and it's opposite. Okay, it's not dependent or conditioned by where you began. Okay, you've transcended that, and you've moved to a new so-called higher ground. Okay, and it's a new beginning. It's a new starting point, and so it's absolute in the sense of it's not conditioned. It is now a new foundation.
I would assume listeners would be able to understand why that kind of thinking is crucial for revolutionary politics, and how that sort of approach that really gets at changing the ground of a contradiction differentiates revolutionary politics from reformist politics.
Yeah, and just being reactive to the things that they throw at us all the time. Where do we get to express our own strivings, our own politics, our own needs? Okay. And instead of you look at Donald Trump. What does he try to do? He tries to make everybody react to him all the time and every moment. He's very good at that. How do we, how do we move beyond that?
Right.
Can I say something just
Mm-hmm.
because I've been very abstract, and I've purposely been very abstract. I've avoided giving examples, and it's not because I don't like examples or I want to make this, unintelligible. Here's the problem. It's easy to understand the examples. And people come away and they've understood the examples, and therefore they think they've understood the principles. But it doesn't work like that. You can understand the examples, but what you're understanding about the examples is not the principles. So you have to hear and think through the articulation of the principles, so you really get the principles. So once the principles have been articulated, then we can turn to examples and so forth. But I think, because I've experienced this, you ask a question about this or that aspect of the dialectic, and somebody says, well, I was taking out the garbage yesterday. It's like, what comes to your mind is the smelliness of the garbage and the green plastic garbage can, and just you get all involved in the concrete particulars, and you don't grasp the principle involved really well. You need certain terms and certain concepts to be able to grasp the general principle, and that's lacking when you just hit people with examples. So I don't mean to be like incomprehensible, although I understand that the danger of that. It's just people have to understand this. You have to think in a different way about the ideas themselves rather than how they're applied.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. In just a moment, we'll return to this conversation about Hegel, Dunayevskaya, and Marx with Andrew Kleiman. But first, a few words from Andrew Clark of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Hello, this is Anja Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist-Humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marx's philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
So I thought maybe we could pivot here in the discussion and talk about some of the ways that Hegel has been interpreted by other Marxist thinkers. And maybe we should start with Engels, because he's one of the most influential writers talking on this topic of what Hegel means for Marxists.
Yes, Engels has been really influential in the history of Marxist thought, for providing kind of like a standard gloss on, what Hegel's about and what he's good for and what he's not good for.
Right, and partly this is Engels has this power of setting the interpretation because when he's writing Anti-Düring and talking about the influence of Hegel on Marxist thought, none of Marx's early writings, which are stamped so much with the Hegelian influence, are known to people, and they don't become known for many decades after Engels sort of popularizes Hegel.
Right, and because Anti-Düring is a book that, right, Engels writes, I read it to Marx, and we had this idea that Marx agreed with everything in it, and in some sense it was a joint work, and just the entirety of that phase of Marxism was to join Marx and Engels, Marx and Engels this, Marx and Engels that, and that provided it made it easy for a lot of people because Engels was a lot easier to understand and closer to their thinking in some ways, and it's taken decades of thinking about this and people writing about this, Dunayevskaya being one of them, to say, look, there are differences between Marx and Engels, and they're particularly sharp with regard to philosophy. Marx had a degree, a doctorate in philosophy. Engels not so much. So, in any case, yeah, Engels provided this gloss that has been very influential, and I think really not helpful in the end. And what he basically did is to say, the dialectic method is revolutionary, but in Hegel, it's enclosed in a system, and the system is conservative and reactionary. And so, Hegel reconciled himself to the monarchy, the absolutist state, and that's the real import of, not only his political thought, but also, his pure, proper philosophy, his metaphysics, his epistemology, and the way, according to Engels and according to a lot of other people, in which the Hegelian system is conservative and reactionary is precisely the thing that we were talking about before when we referenced the formula thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But it doesn't have to be that. Okay, but the point is, thesis, antithesis, synthesis results in a closure. And Engels, like a lot of other people, said, the Hegelian system results in a closure. It's the end of history. I think he actually mentions that phrase, end of history. And that's anathema to any revolutionary, this idea of an end to history. So we've got to reject that. So what Engels tries to do is to say, well, yeah, we've got to reject this closure, okay, but we want to retain the dialectic method. Okay, and you can separate the two neatly. So we can extract and use, so to speak, the dialectic method, but we have to jettison the system. And what that means is jettisoning the absolutes, because the absolutes are the ending, so to speak, of the system. At the end of Hegel's major books, they culminated in an absolute knowing, absolute idea, absolute mind. Okay, so are those closures? Well, actually, Engels says, when you get to the idea in the logic, the absolute idea, it's not actually a closure, because then you move into new realms. But when you reach the end of the entire Hegelian system, with the philosophy of mind, you reach absolute mind, then your closure, that's a straight out closure. That's the end of history. That's conservative, that's reactionary. We got to, just abandon that, reject that entirely. So when Dunayevskaya is like, no, the absolutes are not a closure, this is new beginning. Absolute negativity is new beginning. It's ceaseless. It's self-movement. It never ends. She's going against, at that point it was, I don't know, 90 years of tradition, and now it's another 50. To my mind, the basic problem in what Engels was proposing is he's begging the question. He presumes that you can separate neatly method from system. That's not something you can just assume. I liken it to like driving a car. Okay, that's the method. But let's drive a car such that we don't get this result. Let's drive the car such that we don't go anywhere. You can't drive a car without going somewhere. If you've got a dialectic method, it generates certain results. So I just don't think the whole thing works. It sounds good, but I just don't think I don't think it works.
Aside from the sort of logical problem, does Engels' interpretation lend itself to certain types of political conclusions that might also be problematic?
Well, it leads to a rejection of the dialectic of the absolute. Because one says, well, let's not go there, because that's just going to lead to end of history, reconciliation with the monarchical state. And what we need is, I guess what the idea is, let's just have these series of, never-ending confrontations, never-ending contradictions, but principally it lacks this self-movement.
Right, the self-movement is what gets jettisoned.
I think so, yeah. That seems right to me. Let me think about it, but that seems right to me, yeah.
Well, of course, Dunayevskaya had no shortage of criticisms for Stalinism and the sort of approach to dialectics, amongst other things, that was taken by Stalinists. But is there a relationship between that sort of Stalinist dialectics and Engels' gloss on Hegel?
Well, I mean, the one point that they definitely have in common is this rejection of Hegel's absolutes.
Right. And with it, the idea of absolute negativity and self-movement.
Yes, because that's what in Dunayevskaya's understanding of it, the absolutes are absolute negativity, right? They are this ceaseless self-movement that generates new beginnings, transcends the ground of the previous oppositions. So there's a rejection of that, and she sees that as always tied to an attempt to actually declare the Stalinist regimes the end of history. Right. The one thing they don't want is ceaseless self-movement against their rule.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, you can't blame Engels for that, of course. But,
right.
Cannot blame Engels, but yeah, there's a lot of focus on in both Engels and the Stalinist thinking, a lot of focus on the category of contradiction. Which is an important category, but what that seems to do is to leave everything at, you got the starting point and you got that which opposes it. Well, how do you transcend the ground of this opposition? How do you overcome insurmountable contradictions, oppositions? Right. Well, you do what the party tells you. Right. So, Right. I mean, look, I don't know how important Engel's gloss is to all of this. I mean, if there had been no Engels, they would have come to the same conclusion anyway, I think. But just for just an understanding within Marxism generally, I think that this formula of revolutionary method enclosed in a conservative reactionary system that is that of the absolute that leads to closure, end of history. I just think that that's been very influential, even among people who are not really Stalinists. I mean, for instance, Herbert Marcuse. I mean, he understood Hegel really, really deeply, a lot, more deeply than Engels seems to have done. I mean, but Marcuse comes to the same conclusion that you get a closure, you get an end of history, an annulment of all contradiction, opposition when you get to the end of Hegel's system. And Theodor Adorno, basically the same kind of idea. So, I mean, Dunayevskaya is really just going against the whole tradition of Marxism. And I'm not even mentioning Stalinism here. The whole tradition, Engels, Marcuse, Adorno, all of Hegelian Marxism, she's breaking with all of that, at least with respect to the understanding of Hegel's absolutes. Oh, let me just say a word on the word Hegel's absolutes. I mean, there is one absolute, but it has different forms of appearance depending on the sphere of knowledge that one's talking about. So there's the idea, there's mind, there's knowing, right? But absolute is absolute, right? There's one absolute. But we can talk of absolutes because of the different forms of appearance.
So what about Lenin? I mean, Lenin's writing and thinking about Hegel is less well known because he doesn't have like published works where he discusses Hegel. But Lenin did read Hegel and take a lot of notes on Hegel, and his notes on his reading of Hegel, which he wrote while he was in exile prior to the Russian Revolution, were very influential on Dunayevskaya, and she discusses his notes in great detail as she is sort of exploring the potentials of Hegel's philosophy.
Yeah, just a very, very little bit, because I don't deal with the substance of her debt to Lenin. She has a huge debt to Lenin.
Yeah.
And she has huge differences with Lenin. I don't really go into the substance, but just to kind of do the chronology that I was doing, I want to say, okay, here's where she stands in relation to Engels, here's where she stands in relation to Lenin, here's where she stands in relationship to Marcuse. But Dunayevskaya has a huge debt to Hegel.
To Lenin.
Excuse me, yes. Dunayevskaya has a huge debt to Lenin, and I think that she understood her work on philosophy as carrying through a line of thinking project that Lenin articulated and began but never carried out. And that has to do with the notebooks that you're referring to. Lenin is dealing with, which Marxists had not dealt with. He's not just dealing with contradiction, category of so-called essence. He's dealing with the concept or the notion, which is the logic of free movement. He's looking at all of this, and he gets this insight that human cognition not only reflects the objective world, but it creates it. Okay, I mean, there's a sense in which cognition just reflects what's there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's the materialist standpoint.
Right.
But here you got Lenin, the arch materialist. He wrote Materialism and Imperial Criticism and all of this.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, midst of World War I, he says cognition not only reflects the objective world, but creates it. That's like, idealism, right?
Right.
Okay. And this is what Dunayevskaya was concerned to draw out for revolutionary thought in particular, right? The creative aspect of thinking and its importance for revolution. Okay, and this goes back to Marx's basic understanding of absolute negativity, striving not to remain something that you've become, but are in the absolute movement of becoming, right? And so this creation is not just the creation of something external, although it involves that, but it's the self-creation, the self-transformation.
Right.
The very simple point is that our thought is crucial to this whole development. We're not just buffeted by external events and forces that we react to, but we can, take control of the process and guide it in a way that is developmental, self-developmental, and results in something new. This is the revolutionary perspective to a T, as I understand it.
Yeah.
So this idea of cognition not only reflecting the objective world, but creating it, this is what it's clear to me, she regarded as the burden, the special, her unique contribution was developing this that had been articulated in Hegel. This had been articulated in Lenin, but he never developed it. And so she ties this to Lenin not exploring the philosophy of mind. He goes through the entirety of Hegel's Science of Logic, but at the end of the Science of Logic, Hegel is referring to talking about absolute liberation and the idea of freely releasing itself, completing its self-liberation in the science of spirit, in other words, the philosophy of mind. But Lenin was not impelled by this last bit of the Science of Logic where Hegel's saying this. He wasn't impelled to go on to the philosophy of mind that Hegel was leading him on to. So he didn't feel impelled to explore this logic of self-liberation. And so that's Dunayevskaya's criticism. So the debt is the same thing as the criticism. The debt is he's got this idea of self-liberation, of cognition, not just self-liberation in activity, but in thought as well. Cognition creating the world, but he just doesn't develop it.
Pivoting slightly, one thing you write about in your paper that I thought was important was this question of whether Dunayevskaya is guilty of distorting Hegel. And you have, I think, a nuanced understanding of that.
I guess that's good, right?
And there are two different questions. One is like, where do the concepts lead if you follow them independently? And then the second question is interpretation of texts, and that there are two different things. And Dunayevskaya is more focused on the former question of how these ideas are, in Hegel, are, I don't want to say useful, but are important for radical thought, and to sort of follow them where she thinks they lead naturally.
Right. That is, I think, the issue. Where they lead naturally. What is the logic of the dialectic of negativity itself? Not here's how I feel like applying it versus how Hegel felt like applying it. Okay, so she basically splits the issue of Hegel's dialectic into Hegel's self-understanding of what he did, what Hegel was trying to do, trying to say, And she leaves that aside. And then there is what he did say with the logic of the dialectic is in and for itself. So she radically splits the two. And she says, I'm only concerned with the latter, the logic itself. And, she says, no matter what he wanted to say, look, the dialectic itself is revolutionary. It does not come to an end. There's a ceaseless self-movement, generates new beginnings. I think she's really successful at doing that. So she's not unaware of the issue, and she's not trying to say at all. I mean, she's explicitly rejecting the idea that she should be interpreted as providing a commentary or interpretation on Hegel's intentions, what Hegel wanted to say, what Hegel thought he was saying. That's not what she's about. I mean, at one point, she actually gets at this issue at least twice in Philosophy and Revolution in the book. But at one point she says, let's subject Hegel's dialectic to Hegel's dialectic, or something like that, right? Let's subject Hegel himself to Hegel's method. Okay, so let's look at the dialectic, and not get burdened by, here's what the person wanted to say. And, if you read Hegel, he's again and again doing something very similar. He's saying, here's what somebody means, but it's not what they're saying. Right? And, so she's saying, look at what he's saying. Not what he means, look at what he's saying.
Well, that's all the time we have today for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. Please stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to hear more episodes, to join in the conversation, or to leave a donation. Don't forget to share the podcast with friends, however you do that, through social media or otherwise. We always appreciate people sending the podcast around, leaving comments, liking the podcast, and all those things. Stay safe out there.